Beginning on the 17th September, the long, ugly struggle between Israel and Hezbollah took a rather strange turn, when thousands of pagers and later walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah for communication suddenly started to explode. I've talked in the past about how important supply chains can be, but in this case the consequences for Hezbollah allowing theirs to be compromised was dramatic, kinetic, and sometimes lethal. And so today we're going to look into some of what we've learned about the what, why and how of these incidents. And then, because this is a defence economics channel, ask what this might teach us about the importance of supply chains and supply chain security. Whether you're talking about the Trojans making a spectacularly bad call on their giant wooden horse suppliers, or modern states trying to protect their networks and industrial supply chains. To do that, we'll work through things in sequence, starting with some background to the Israel-Hezbollah conflict and the what and how of this particular incident. Then we'll work through some of the flow-on consequences and Israeli follow-up strikes, and try and broadly assess the overall impact so far. Then we'll pivot into some broader questions, like why a country may or may not decide to target opposing leaders during a conflict, and how this incident fits into wider concerns about supply chain security around the world. A quick note that while these strikes take place in the context of a wider conflict or series of conflicts, my intention today is to keep things quite narrow. I'm not a Middle East specialist, so my focus is going to be on things like the mechanics of the operation, with a significant asterisk of uncertainty of course, and those aforementioned supply chains. In the future we may look at related issues from Gaza to Iranian missile strikes. For today though, we're going to have plenty to talk about with beeper bombs, leadership targeting and supply chain security. Now, before we jump into it, quick word from a sponsor. And today that means a chance to welcome back my long-term VPN of choice, private internet access. You and I both know the internet provides us pretty incredible access to everything from entertainment and education to some pretty versatile means of communication. But at the same time, interacting with the greatest data free-for-all in human history arguably comes with some privacy risks, especially in a world where it can sometimes seem that protecting that privacy is growing ever harder. When discussing military equipment on a battlefield, I previously raised the concept of the survivability onion, where survival comes down to layering tools and practices together. Yes, you might want armour to tank a hit, but also perhaps concealment to avoid being seen and engaged in the first place. And when it comes to protecting your privacy online, you might think of a VPN as being one of those layers. Sure, if you email your passwords directly to a scammer or have a bomb on your phone, a VPN might not help you. But with a click, it can allow you to reroute your internet traffic and change your publicly perceived IP address, and potentially shift how your activity is logged. One reason I chose private internet access is because they have long stated they have a no-logs policy, which they state has been audited and court-tested. And they combine that with the transparency of an open-source codebase and servers across 91 countries and 50 US states. They're also available cross-platform and advertise compatibility with a range of streaming services. And notably, unlike some streaming services, a single private internet access subscription allows you to cover an unlimited number of devices. So if you're interested in adding this particular tool to your kit, there'll be a link in the description which will give you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, covering an unlimited number of devices with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so with my thanks to them for their support, let's get back to it. Okay, so before we get into how thousands of handheld communication devices ended up exploding in Lebanon, we probably need a quick bit of background on the state of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah leading up to September 17th. In 2006, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1701. It was intended to help end the 2006 Lebanon War and called for a range of things, including the disarmament of all armed groups in Lebanon, so that there would be no weapons or armed authority in Lebanon other than those of the Lebanese state. It also applied a range of provisions to an area of southern Lebanon between the Litani River to the north and the so-called Blue Line to the south. The only weapons or armed personnel present there were meant to belong either to the Lebanese military or the UN peacekeeping force, UNIFIL. On paper, that meant the Israeli Defence Force couldn't cross the UN Blue Line to the south, while forces of the Iranian-backed Hezbollah had to remain north of the Litani River. I say on paper because I spoke to a number of people who were stationed there as part of UNIFIL who indicated, surprise, surprise, that it was never that clean and simple. For one thing, while the resolution said from the start that organisations like Hezbollah should be disarmed, as soon as the resolution passed, there was a lot of disagreement over who exactly should do it. The UN Secretary-General said that dismantling Hezbollah was not the direct mandate of the United Nations and that it was his understanding that it would be the Lebanese who would do it. Meanwhile, the Lebanese Defence Minister around the same time said that they wouldn't be deploying their army to southern Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah. Basically, everyone voting said it would be a great idea if Hezbollah's guns were taken off them, but Hezbollah pretty strongly disagreed and no one was keen to go and take them. except perhaps the IDF, which everyone else presumably thought was a very bad idea. Like many UN peacekeeping forces, UNIFIL also had quite limiting rules of engagement. As you can see on screen there, it could employ the proportionate and gradual use of force for a range of purposes, including self-defence, and to ensure the area of operations wasn't utilised for hostile activities, but that didn't exactly translate to kicking down doors and clearing Hezbollah weapon caches. One assessment then would be that the resolution didn't really end the ability of Hezbollah to operate in southern Lebanon, nor the IDF to fire across the blue line. It did, however, for many years correlate with a significant reduction in how much fire was being exchanged. Later, in October 2023, however, after the Hamas attacks on Israel and everything that followed them, the security situation between Israel, Hezbollah and Iran appears to have been shifting. In one piece, the CSIS puts the change in Israeli behaviour down to 3 factors. A change in risk tolerance after October 2023, the displacements of civilians close to the border, which notably happened on both sides of the blue line, and apprehension over Hezbollah building up its weapons stockpiles and military capabilities. If we look at some of what the parties themselves have said about their motivations and objectives behind intensifying the number of combat actions in this area, we've seen examples like Netanyahu saying that it would be impossible for Israeli citizens from the area to return to their homes without a, quote, fundamental change in the security situation in the north, end quote. Whereas Israeli Defence Minister Gallant has been quoted as saying that we will continue with additional blows that are already prepared until we achieve our goal, the return of the residents of the north to their home, and to achieve this goal, we are willing to take any action. Gallant has also referred to, quote, destroying Hezbollah's capabilities that have been built up over 20 years, end quote. Meanwhile, statements by Hezbollah, including some by Nasrallah himself before his recent change in status, linked their group's objectives in the fighting to the war in Gaza, saying that they would continue taking action until a ceasefire was agreed there. Between October 7th, 2023 and September 29th, 2024, Hezbollah would release a significant number of propaganda videos showing attacks specifically using anti-tank guided missiles against targets across the border. As you can see from the map on the right there, most of these operations were being launched against relatively shallow targets in northern Israel from positions deep inside the demilitarized zone of southern Lebanon. There were obviously some more capable weapon systems in play or in Hezbollah inventory, but most of what we saw documented and released by the group was using smaller, often more mobile and shorter ranged equipment. The Israelis, for their part, were also frequently engaging targets in Lebanon. In relation to the exchanges of fire that were taking place, according to UN figures, between the 8th of October 2023 and 30th of June 2024, there were 15,101 trajectories tracked, 12,459 of which from the south to the north, and 2,642 from north of the blue line going south. But while this pattern played out over the course of the year, as we got to September 2024, 2 things seemed to change in relatively rapid succession. Firstly, the sheer number of reported strikes and violent incidents escalated dramatically. What you can see on screen is a chart prepared by the CSIS based on data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Based on that data, you can see that prior to October 2023, there were at most in your average week a handful of incidents making it into the dataset. Then, for much of the next 12 months, we saw the number of weekly incidents stabilise at very roughly 200 or so per week, before suddenly jumping to more than 400 incidents in the week beginning the 15th of September, and double that again in the week following. Towards the tail end, we also saw more and more of those attacks be directed against longer-range targets. This chart shows the ramp-up of strikes into Lebanon by the IDF, and particularly the number of those strikes that were directed against targets as far as Beirut or beyond. In that data, we also see a similar pattern of range escalation from Hezbollah, albeit on a smaller scale, with this chart showing the uptick in strikes making it at least as far as Haifa in northern Israel, and a handful making it as far as Tel Aviv. All of these escalation markers are consistent with what some analysts have identified as a likely shift in Israeli objectives. As the CSIS puts it, quote, Israel is increasingly shifting from a traditional deterrent approach of threatening punishment to one of weakening Hezbollah's capabilities to the point that the group cannot effectively respond, end quote. And that observed shift from deter to degrade would arguably be consistent with the way we saw the Pager plot play out. But before we get into the strike itself and the potential warnings it might have for observers around the world, I want to ask how we may have gotten to a point where thousands of Hezbollah communication devices decided to simultaneously do their best impression of a frag grenade, or at least a Galaxy Note 7. The story probably begins with the combined blessing and curse that is the modern mobile phone. Now look, there is absolutely no denying it. In a lot of ways, mobile phones are fantastic. That said, there are a number of features of modern phones that make them a little less great if you're running an insurgency or a criminal gang or a secret military organisation, for example. Because as militaries, governments and other organisations around the world have recognised, in order to function, a mobile phone needs to ping a network. And that's a step towards potentially giving up your location. Not to mention all the other ways in which a phone might enable the tracking of a user. There's the risk that comes from pinging a real cell phone tower, the risk from pinging a fake tower, sometimes called a Stingray device. Then you often have the built-in global navigation system, apps and systems that might have been downloaded or installed on the device that can enable quite detailed tracking through a variety of mechanisms. And even if you manage to keep malicious software and hardware out of your physical device, depending on how you're choosing to communicate, you still might find yourself in a situation where someone is able to compromise the network that you're communicating through in order to intercept or eavesdrop on your communications. According to some of the reporting we've seen over the last couple of years, as well as some statements by Hezbollah officials themselves, it may have been believed or suspected that mobile phone communications could be intercepted or the phones located. And as recently as July this year, there was a report in Reuters suggesting that Hezbollah had started employing some low-tech mechanisms to partly or fully subvert Israeli intelligence gathering efforts. To quote from the article, Israel's electronic eavesdropping, including hacking into cell phones and computers, is also widely regarded as among the world's most sophisticated. Hezbollah has learned from its losses and adapted its tactics in response, 6 sources familiar with the group's operations told Reuters, speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive security matters. Cell phones, which can be used to track a user's location, have been banned from the battlefield in favour of more old-fashioned communication means, including pagers and couriers who deliver verbal messages in person, 2 of the sources said. To all that, I might quickly add that if you do think you've found a way to defeat an opponent's intelligence gathering efforts, one of the things you probably don't want to happen is for people to go and brief journalists on how you're doing it. And so how that article ended up with as many sources as it did is probably a fair question. Another question, especially some younger viewers might be asking, is what on earth is a pager and why might it be better from a security perspective, assuming you can find a model that doesn't explode? Long story short, these are small retro communication devices intended to receive a radio signal and then convert that signal into a relatively simple message, whether that just be a vibration and a beep or a basic text and or numerical message. For the most part, these have been supplanted in the market by things like mobile phones and personal computers. But for those operators that still use them, they might offer a couple of advantages compared to those newer technologies. Advantage 1 for a lot of potential users is that pagers are not reliant on the mobile phone network. That might be a really handy benefit in situations where there is either shitty mobile phone coverage, say an Australian mine site, or where mobile phone coverage may be temporarily interrupted or saturated, like an emergency context, or if you're running a major paramilitary organisation and you're worried that opposing intelligence may have compromised the phone network. And questions of network security aside, there are a range of reasons that pagers might be harder to detect than phones. In part, that's because while some pagers, like two-way pagers, are capable of transmitting back, others are receive only. They can receive and interpret a signal, but not beam one out that could potentially be intercepted. So according to a lot of the reporting out there, Hezbollah decided to downgrade the tech level on its communications, so to speak, earlier this year. In that respect, you could think of switching over to pagers as a kind of halfway measure between the convenience but vulnerability of mobile phones on one end and more traditional communication methods like couriers and typewriters that aren't vulnerable at all to digital intrusion. And I'm not joking there about typewriters being an option in 2024 either. There are a number of organisations out there that either use or have considered using manual typewriters as a more secure method for generating messages and documents. Germany, for example, reportedly looked into the possibility back in 2014. It's old technology, yes, but good luck hacking a piece of paper. So that all explains why Hezbollah might have decided to revert back to some fairly retro communications technology. The next questions are likely where did they come from and where and how may they have been fitted with the remote detonated explosive optional extra. There are a range of difficulties and restrictions that come with trying to get goods into Lebanon, and many nations identifying Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation, including the USA, UK and Japan. Plus, even where sanctions or rules aren't a definitive barrier, I imagine there are probably some companies out there a little bit wary of the potential PR implications of becoming Hezbollah's primary comms supplier. That's probably one customer testimonial that a lot of brands would prefer to do without. What that means is a supply chain for equipment like this is likely to be more complicated, more opaque, and ultimately more vulnerable. In terms of identifying the potential source, experts have looked at photographs of some of the pages that went through explosive disassembly and identified them as AR-924s. That's a model reportedly associated with the firm Gold Apollo, headquartered in Taipei. But they indicate they didn't manufacture these pages, they just licensed out the trademark. In this case, they suggest the chain leads to a Hungarian entity, BAC Consulting, but as the name suggests on paper, that's a consultancy, not a manufacturing firm. And according to some reporting, it was a consulting firm with a grand total of 1 employee and no identified facility for making pages. That makes it difficult to answer the question of where do these pages come from and where were they tampered with any degree of certainty, and I want to acknowledge that. But as long as we're comfortable moving a little further into the domain of unproven reporting and a little bit of speculation, there's one recent story that we should look at by the Washington Post, with the major caveat being that the story depends extensively on everyone's favourite piece of evidence, the anonymous source. Those caveats in place, the story suggests the Israeli plan to supply the potentially explosive pages goes back to 2022. At that stage, reportedly Hezbollah had already been using sabotaged walkie-talkies for a number of years, something which checks out given that they will explode later in this story as well. But the pager plan represented a potential opportunity to introduce thousands more sabotage devices into Hezbollah inventory. Hezbollah was reportedly approached by a trusted sales intermediary who reportedly wasn't in on the plan, pitching them on the AR-924 pager. But according to the report, it was Israel that controlled the manufacturing. They were manufactured ab initio with the explosive feature built in, a small explosive charge concealed inside the battery. That reportedly meant that even if the device was disassembled, inspected, or even X-rayed, the tampering might not be detected. It's worth noting that that explanation seems to track with some of what we observed later. The fact that these all functioned as explosives, but also the fact they weren't detected up to this point. You'd expect an organisation like Hezbollah to be relatively paranoid, with good reason. So one imagines if this had been a backyard bodge job, where a small amount of explosives and fragmentation casing was just inserted haphazardly into the device before supplying it, that may well have been detected as soon as someone, opened the device up. And there is every reason to believe that an organisation like Hezbollah would be motivated to check at least some of the electronics it was bringing into inventory for potential conversion into explosive devices. It's not that outlandish an idea either from an engineering perspective or from the view of historical precedent. Intelligence services are known to have form when it comes to sabotaging communication devices, and the image I have on the right there is of an alleged Hamas bomb maker, reportedly nicknamed the Engineer, who died when his phone exploded on the 5th of January 1996. So it's probably a bit of a stretch to say this was an entirely new and unexpected MO. At the same time, it has to be said that some other reports, claiming to draw on sources close to Hezbollah, indicate their belief that the devices weren't manufactured with the explosives in place, but rather were tampered with at some point along the way. Whatever the case, whether they were tampered with en route or built with these features in place, thousands of the devices appear to have made it to Lebanon and into Hezbollah hands. According to the Post, many senior Israeli officials only found out about the pages during a meeting in September. There were reportedly concerns in Israeli circles that if they did nothing, Hezbollah would soon discover the alterations, meaning they were stuck with basically a short-run, go-no-go decision. Detonate the devices in the short run before the alterations were discovered and when they could still do significant damage, but at the risk of potential escalation, or hold off, even at the cost of potential detection. As for why it was expected that Hezbollah would eventually discover the sabotage, a Reuters article puts forward a very specific claim, namely that even though the device might pass a scan because the explosive material was concealed inside the battery would inevitably drain faster than a battery of that weight should, because part of the battery was made of bomb instead of battery. To quote from the article, at some point, Hezbollah noticed the battery was draining faster than expected, the Lebanese source said. However, the issue did not appear to raise major security concerns. The group was still handing its members pages hours before the attack. End quote. It stands to reason, however, that even if Hezbollah was writing off those concerns in the short run, there might have been some in Israel that perceived a military imperative to use the devices now, rather than risking someone in Hezbollah looking at this or some other clue a little more closely. To quote from the article, it was clear that there were some risks, an Israeli official said. Some, including senior IDF officials, warned of a potential full-scale escalation with Hezbollah, even as Israeli soldiers were continuing operations against Hamas in Gaza. But others, chiefly Mossad, saw an opportunity to disrupt the status quo with something more intense. The United States, Israel's closest ally, was not informed of the booby-trap pages or the internal debate over whether to trigger them, US officials said. Ultimately, Netanyahu approved triggering the devices while they could inflict maximum damage. Over the following week, Mossad began preparations for detonating both the pagers and walkie-talkies already in circulation. End quote. A lot of that story is built on anonymous sources and wrapped in uncertainty. But what happened after the things started exploding, that's a little bit clearer. Wave 1, as I'm going to call it, is when thousands of these pagers appeared to start detonating on the 17th of September, about a month ago at time of recording. According to some sources, about 5,000 devices may have been affected during this phase, and according to the Lebanese Health Ministry, the initial casualty count was nearly 3,000 wounded and a killed count somewhere between the high single and low double digits. Those figures seem very consistent with a low-yield, limited lethality explosion. We're talking about a device potentially exploding in someone's pocket or in their hands, and yet fewer than 1% of those impacted being killed. At that point, you have to wonder if the entire operation would have actually been more lethal if it consisted entirely of shouting every member of the Hezbollah leadership a free holiday to Thailand, along with complimentary motorcycle rental. That said, reportedly thousands of people were affected, hundreds quite significantly, and according to the Lebanese Health Ministry, there was a range of individuals caught up in those casualty figures. The claimed casualties included both Hezbollah figures and ordinary civilians, although likely not in equal proportion. But one reported casualty in particular stands out as being potentially awkward for a lot of the parties involved. According to Iran's Fars news agency, their ambassador to Lebanon was amongst those injured in the detonations and was under observation in hospital as of September 18. On one hand, if Israel is responsible, this might be a slightly awkward one because targeting ambassadors is on the list of things you are not meant to do. On the other hand, I don't believe Tehran has yet explained why their ambassador to Lebanon was close enough to a Hezbollah-issued communication device in order to be injured in a very low-yield explosion. The ambassador was later released from hospital and tweeted online that he considered the injury to have been an honour. The very next day, as the metaphorical smoke was still clearing from the page detonations, reporting indicated that other electronic devices in Hezbollah inventory had suffered the same spontaneous detonation problem. As one article put it on the 18th, a day after thousands of pages exploded across Lebanon, more explosions of handheld devices, including walkie-talkie radios, mobile phones, laptops, and even solar power cells, have killed at least 20 people and injured 450. There are question marks, I think, over the claims around at least some of those devices. But if we're talking about the walkie-talkies, those we have some visual evidence for and also align with the content of that Washington Post article we mentioned earlier. That article suggests that Israel had managed to introduce these sabotaged handheld devices into Hezbollah inventory long before the pager plot got started. But it suggests that Israel may have seen more value in using them to monitor Hezbollah communications as opposed to using them as a kinetic asset. If that's somewhere close to the truth, it's logical to assume that the Israeli decision to detonate these devices probably links to a similar go-no-go decision as we saw with the pagers, with the decision to go ahead and pop the pagers, forcing the same decision to be made with the walkie-talkies. It seems logical that if you discovered that one of your communication devices had been modified to contain more than the desirable amount of explodium, you might be tempted to start breaking open some of your other devices in order to check whether or not they'd received the same treatment. In terms of casualties, this wave of attacks appears to have affected fewer individuals, hundreds rather than thousands, but the reported lethality rate as a percentage of all those affected appears to have been higher, suggesting there might have been a larger explosive, for example, in the walkie-talkies as compared to the smaller pagers. For me, though, that second wave of detonations isn't really the end of this story, and instead they form part of a wider operational context. One where the Israelis appear to have prioritised continuing to go after senior figures in the Hezbollah leadership. This effort doesn't appear to have been limited to any single individual, but the most notable name, in the final days of September, was a founding member and at that point leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. He became the organisation's Secretary-General, its essential leader, in February 1992, after his predecessor was killed in an Israeli airstrike. On the 27th of September, it appears that he suffered the same fate, with Hezbollah confirming his death shortly thereafter. The reason I link the sabotage of the communication devices to the death of individuals like Nasrallah is they both represent, arguably, strikes against Hezbollah's command and control functions. For an organisation to be able to act effectively, it needs to be able to move information, and it needs people to be able to make decisions. These efforts appear to have gone after both those things. And as we've discussed in the past, there's often a generally applicable principle that it's harder to deal with multiple problems all at the same time than the same number of problems spread out over time. To use an analogy, if the water pumps in a city break down for a couple of hours, you can probably handle it. If a fire breaks out in a city, you can probably handle it. But if a fire breaks out while the water pumps are broken, then it might be time for Nero to break out his fiddle. Similarly, part of the logic here may have been that by going after communications and commanders at the same time, the effect could be compounded. And for their part, the IDF claims that a significant number of Hezbollah leaders have been affected one way or the other. As you can see on the right there, it includes everything from the commander of Hezbollah's engineering force to various unit commanders, to a commander who'd been on the US wanted list for years, partly in connection with the 1983 bombing of the US Embassy in Beirut. Just how much damage the beeper bombs, walkie-talkie explosions, and the attacks on individuals like Nasrallah did to Hezbollah's ability to fight is something that's still being contested among various analysts. Many appear to believe that, at the very least, it severely diminished Hezbollah's ability to coordinate large-scale operations in the short term. And we'll come back to some of the debate about how enduring some of this damage might be a little bit later on. But whatever the overall evaluation, most of the reporting in the immediate aftermath of the strike highlighted a classic difficulty that comes from a strategy built around targeting the opposing leadership. Usually there's just someone next in line to take their place. In this case, the initial favourite to succeed Nasrallah appears to have been his cousin. The article on the right there is fairly typical of some of the Western reporting on the topic in the first week of October, with France 24 suggesting that barring an unexpected turn of events within Hezbollah or another targeted strike by the Israelis handicapping the group even further, Nasrallah's cousin is likely to be tapped to take over as Hezbollah's new leader, despite the fact that another figure, Naim Qassem, is the group's official number 2. Presumably the new leader then would have moved to try and shut down any remaining security breaches and generally reorganise after all the damage that had been done. Or at least that may have happened if he hadn't himself been targeted in an Israeli airstrike just a couple of days later. Whether this was the result purely of Israeli intelligence gathering efforts or someone within Hezbollah deciding to embrace the Klingon school of workplace promotions, we'll probably never know. In this case, compared to with Nasrallah, Hezbollah was much slower to confirm the results of the strike. But the Israelis have gone public declaring him dead, which is generally something you don't want to do from an information warfare perspective unless you're relatively sure. Just in case they later turn out not to be dead and you end up looking like either you lied, were misinformed, or your opponent has developed the ability to come back from the dead, none of which are good for your prospects. And yet Netanyahu would very publicly claim that Nasrallah was dead, his replacement was dead, and the replacement of the replacement was dead, suggesting an Israeli effort not just to launch a decapitation strike against Hezbollah, but to continue doing so in order to prevent the leadership from regenerating and the confusion from ending. If we're trying to understand what Tel Aviv might be ultimately trying to achieve through these efforts, however, we have to acknowledge the proxy problem, namely that Hezbollah, like Hamas and the Houthis, all reportedly have links to Iran. As you can see on screen there, the backing these groups sometimes get from Tehran isn't always subtle. And so while deploying conventional military force against opponents like Hamas and Hezbollah, the Israelis arguably face some pretty hard limits. They can attempt to target things like leaders, military personnel, weapon stockpiles and infrastructure in order to break down the combat power of these opponents, but what they probably can't do is destroy the source of potential financial and military assistance flowing from Iran. To me, that suggests that as long as Tehran has the resources and political will to do so, it's likely possible that even after severe damage, Hezbollah would be able to regenerate its combat power over time. Although how much time we're talking there likely depends on a range of factors, including the scale of resources provided, internal Hezbollah dynamics, and the raw amount of damage that Israeli actions are able to inflict. While these things are still very much playing out, I'd suggest the most likely scenario here from a military perspective is not so much the destruction of Hezbollah, but instead a significant reduction in Hezbollah's ability to readily coordinate and act on a larger scale, especially in the short term. And some analysts have suggested that the reasons for that disruption may go a lot further than just the direct consequences of eliminating certain leaders or destroying communication equipment. You have to factor in elements like potential uncertainty over what other communication devices or methods may have been compromised, or more broadly, where intelligence leaks in the organisation may originate. Some Hezbollah operatives, for example, might be faced with the need to decide who and what equipment they can trust. And when it comes to the question of new leaders being selected and establishing themselves, one imagines there may sometimes be questions over whether they have the same experience, capabilities and support across the organisation that their predecessors did, especially if people start asking questions as to why they potentially survived when others were on the receiving end of Israeli airstrikes. In short, sweeping damage to an organisation like Hezbollah's leadership roster may not be lethal, but it's also not something an organisation can just readily shrug off in most cases. And in terms of the organisation's total military capacity, even if further Israeli actions aren't taken, the road to a full recovery may not exactly be a short one. But now I want to get to the point that I'm sure some of you, who are familiar with the channel over a longer period of time, always knew was coming. What this incident tells us, and also what it might teach us about the importance of securing your supply chain. Because at the end of the day, a supply chain failure is exactly what this was. Hezbollah wasn't just impacted by these explosives, it purchased and distributed them. Now, to be fair, as far as supply chain best practice goes, don't buy communication devices with bombs in them is fairly intuitive. And going forward, it seems reasonable that most supply chain-based threats won't be like this one. Having explosives inserted into mobile phones, for example, so they can be used as part of a kinetic campaign, is likely a low-frequency event for a whole range of reasons. It takes a lot of resources to manufacture modern electronics. A lot of the supply chains that are there are pretty closely controlled and monitored. And even just from an engineering perspective, things like modern smartphones tend to be so densely packed. Potential saboteurs might struggle to find space to fit an additional payload without being easily detectable or compromising the operation of the device. In short, many supply chain security threats are unlikely to be of the concealed explosives nature. But while it's relatively rare to have a very public case like this with dramatic explosive consequences, globally, supply chain resilience, integrity and security is a massive concern for militaries and governments. Two more common types of threat then that might be worth reflecting on given this recent example are vulnerability to disruption, especially if you're reliant on a potential competitor for the supply of some vitally needed resource that they can cut off in the event of a crisis, or alternatively, some much more subtle types of subversion, particularly when it comes to data and intelligence gathering. Physics might demand that to generate a bigger yield, an explosive needs to take up space. But you can potentially be pretty subtle when it comes to software, silicon, and data. And in the 21st century, we've seen some very public cases of governments getting quite defensive about what suppliers are able to access critical infrastructure projects or the military supply chain. One very high-profile example here is telecommunications equipment, where security organisations and governments have sometimes been incredibly reluctant to sign off on the use of certain foreign hardware in building up things like 5G networks and telecommunications infrastructure more broadly. In 2020, for example, the UK didn't just ban the installation of new equipment built by Chinese firm Huawei into the country's 5G network, it required firms to plan to pull out a lot of the Huawei kit they had already installed and replace it with equipment manufactured by, as the digital secretary put it, non-high-risk vendors. The initial goal was for the relevant Huawei equipment to be pulled out of the UK network by 2027. Now, obviously, even the most aggressive Whitehall security hawks probably aren't accusing Huawei of packing the towers with C4 or anything. Instead, the expressed concerns in places like the United States have often been more subtle, related to network security. To quote from one article on the matter, the US argues China's 2017 National Intelligence Law, which says organisations must support, cooperate with and collaborate in national intelligence work, means Beijing could force Huawei to do its bidding, end quote. Although I need to note the very next paragraph reads that Huawei says it has never been asked to spy and would categorically refuse to comply. It adds we would never compromise or harm any country, organisation or individual, especially when it comes to cybersecurity and user privacy protection, end quote. And I'll leave to the audience how you choose to evaluate those two claims. Either way, stated concerns often go far beyond network equipment. It's not just about the stuff that transmits information, it's also about some of the equipment that gathers it. And that can include actual hardware. Back in 2022, the US, UK and Australia, for example, announced that they would be banning Chinese-manufactured security cameras from government buildings because of the potential national security threat they posed, prompting the Australian government to run a quick audit and discover more than 900 such cameras had been installed across more than 250 government buildings. And after you talk about the equipment that gathers information, the equipment that transmits information, what about the equipment that runs the equipment that gathers or transmits information, specifically semiconductors? It's reportedly become policy in the People's Republic of China, for example, to phase out processors made by Intel or AMD in government PCs and to move to replace those with hardware manufactured in China. And because presumably, even if the chip is clean, the network is clean, the cameras and gathering instruments are clean, you can still have very real security concerns associated with the software itself rather than any of the equipment. We've often seen countries impose supply chain restrictions on that as well. And to give one example here, we saw the Chinese government restrict the purchase of computers running the Windows 8 operating system for government purposes, as far back as 2014, with restrictions and policies obviously having continued to evolve since then. We haven't seen similar reporting on the same scale about the United States or NATO members restricting Chinese operating systems in their government systems, but one suspects that might have more to do with them basically never being used there in the first place. Now, I need to stress here that when it comes to government bans or controls on things like hardware or software, it's not always immediately clear how much things are driven by actual immediate security concerns and how much is driven by industrial policy, a desire to support domestic or friendly suppliers. But in recent years, it seems we've seen increasingly more bans and restrictions slam into place, while a lot of resources have sometimes been invested building up alternative suppliers. An extra note here is that as we've seen ever more devices become smart, so digitised, equipped with sensors and a network connection, the range of things in the market that could potentially pose spying or security concerns has increased with it. It may not just be your computer and your phone equipped with a network connection. It may also be your car, your TV, your little home assistant, your smartwatch, your gaming console, or for reasons I have never been able to wrap my head around, your fridge or your juice maker. And wherever the capability exists, security concerns can come with it. In 2022, for example, the Chinese didn't issue a temporary ban on all Western manufactured cars driving in an area around a major party conference. It specifically banned Teslas. Perhaps in part because no one expects Damo's 1985 holding Commodore to be gathering any national security secrets. But the core point here is that military or civilian supply chains alike can represent a major source of risk. Whether that's because the final product has always been intended to do something other than what you intend it to do, or because somewhere along the way your supply chain has been compromised, and just like Hezbollah, you're no longer getting what you think you're getting. Which leads to the question, how might you try and control for that sort of risk? In its supply chain security strategy, the US Defense Logistics Agency pushes 3 key terms to the front page: detection, protection, and redundancy. And you can imagine those steps being widely applicable to supply chains more broadly. You may want to be able to detect or predict the threats or things that might cause you issues, whether that be an unreliable supplier or someone trying to actively sabotage your equipment, and then prevent the problems where you can, and have redundancy for where you can't. But while that's easy to say at a high level, in practice it can get complicated. And the potential answers or countermeasures depend a lot on the nature of the threat you might be concerned with. When it comes to the final product itself being a fundamental risk, the answer is relatively simple, if often very expensive. Don't buy equipment from vendors and sources that you don't absolutely trust. But as we've established, the underlying product and nominal supplier themselves aren't always the risk. If you go to buy a bunch of communications equipment from a supplier in a friendly country, that may not help you much if they're packing their products full of components that some bloke with a Russian accent gave them a really, really good price on. And even if the provider and supplier don't do anything dodgy, maybe there's some tampering that occurs along the way. So if you're trying to be safe here, it's not just about the purchasing decision, it's about security and confidence all the way along the supply chain. At each point along the way, whether you're talking about sourcing raw materials, building the subcomponents, final assembly, transportation and delivery, you'd probably want to understand where the greatest potential points of vulnerability are, both in terms of how likely it is that something goes wrong and how major the problem might be if something does go wrong. It might be comparatively easier to swap out or subvert the raw material sourcing process, for example, but there's probably a much wider range of things that can go wrong from a counterintelligence perspective if an opponent is able to interact with the software or hardware during the manufacture or transportation phase than if they're just trying to substitute in some dodgy materials that won't pass quality control. Although, as we saw with both Boeing and Airbus, after they were allegedly supplied with titanium with fake documentation, a breakdown in supply chain security at any point along the line can absolutely be painful in its own way. But here's the thing, even if you have a relatively good understanding of all of the potential risks that arise all across your supply chain, that doesn't mean controlling for them is necessarily going to be easy. There are a variety of common problems that can torpedo these kind of efforts, and to get a sense of them, what we might do here is work through a hypothetical. So congratulations on your appointment as Kiwiland's new Minister for Digital Administration, Licensing, Usage and Procurement, also known as Dial-Up. After years of tensions, skirmishes and sometimes outright warfare with the neighbouring nation of Emutopia, the Kiwi defence and security apparatus have issued a report that makes for rather sober reading on a vulnerability that they want closed before tensions escalate again. For years at this point, they've been gathering evidence of potential Emutopian infiltration of various Kiwi systems. Not all of your fellow ministers were convinced by evidence that Emutopia always seemed to be aware of Kiwi military movements as if in advance, But after someone searched the term best sport on a government computer system and got a picture of this rather than this, the evidence was considered overwhelming. Your mission, which you are legally required to accept, is to leverage dial-up's resources in order to overhaul Kiwiland's critical infrastructure, reducing the risk of emu-topian spying or potential Hezbollah syndrome. Strategies are written, money appropriated, and instructions given. And then you start to run into some problems. Firstly, there's the simple problem of practicality and availability. On the long list of items that you need to purchase, a lot of them just aren't made in Kiwiland, and some you'd struggle to source even from friendly suppliers in allied countries. Even for, in nominal terms, the world's largest economy, this can be a significant issue, with report after report indicating that despite the Pentagon's best efforts, Chinese suppliers remain a part of the US defence industrial supply chain, and replacing reliance on those materials and products has sometimes proven a very difficult work in progress. For some niche goods, there may not be good suppliers out there that haven't already been purchased or influenced by the massive emu-topian multinationals. In other cases, there may be alternative suppliers out there, they just don't have spare capacity available until 2032. When both Russia and Ukraine determined back in 2022 that they probably needed a lot more drones, neither had the realistic capacity to domestically source everything they needed. And so we often saw comparatively more available DJI products, like the Mavic 3, appear pretty high up the list of things that troops and volunteers were attempting to source. And even well beyond small drones, it's worth highlighting that Russian import substitution efforts in the military sphere remain far from complete. Even now, in the second half of 2024, we continue to see a lot of Russian weapon systems contain a significant amount of Western technology. That's in spite of the fact both that the Russian government has embraced the idea of import substitution and self-reliance, and the fact that sanctions busting tends to involve risks, delays, and additional costs. In many cases, a driving reason for that might just be that Russian industry can't provide a truly perfect analogue in adequate numbers. And so despite Moscow's stated policy goals, the imports have to continue. Sometimes tied to that issue of availability is the problem of compliance. Even if you set out a rule, it's not guaranteed everyone out there is going to follow it. There are a lot of ways that things could potentially go wrong here. You could have people taking advantage of carve-outs and loopholes in order to officially buy products that you don't want them to be buying. Or maybe it's an unofficial, small-scale kind of purchase. While in other cases, the prime contractor might be trying to do the right thing, only to be tricked by those further down the supply chain. Back in 2022, for example, the Pentagon temporarily halted deliveries of the F-35 following the discovery that a contractor had made a magnet used in the aircraft out of cobalt and samarium alloys that came from the People's Republic of China. Deliveries rapidly resumed and the parts in question weren't replaced because the Pentagon decided pretty quickly that the magnets in question weren't a threat to the aircraft and didn't put any sensitive information at risk. But even though the materials in question were found to not be particularly sensitive, the whole thing still reportedly raised concerns about compliance with the US Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, or DFARS, a riveting near 1,900-page tome that I found listed online for a mere $400, just in case anyone wants a real crowd pleaser to put on the coffee table. Reflecting on cases like this one, you can imagine there will often be situations where the concern isn't so much the material itself, but rather the fact that it shouldn't be there. If there's a gap in the net, there's always the chance of something a little more dangerous sneaking through. And in Kiwiland's case, you'd expect Emutopia to be hunting for every single one of those openings. But let's just say, Minister, that somehow you manage. You and your team are absolute legends, and you manage to set up production or find sources for all of the resources that you need. And, even more impressively, you manage to come up with a compliance regime to make sure that everyone actually follows the rules, and that no subcontractor of a subcontractor of a subcontractor is secretly integrating any Emutopian hard or software into their products after getting a suspiciously good deal on them. At this point, you might run into problem number 3, the bill. With some exceptions, supply chain security and sovereignty is usually an upgrade package that comes with a price tag. In many cases, this will just be a natural result of basic economic principles and forces in action. If you publicly rule out a bunch of suppliers for security reasons, congratulations, you've just lowered competition, and all else being equal, competition helps keep prices down. If you tell your prime contractors that they can only source materials from certain sources, and that they have to actively investigate, verify, and monitor their supply chain, all else being equal, that's probably going to translate into a higher cost of goods sold for them, and thus a higher purchase price for you at the department. The UK 5G example might be a bit of an outlier because it includes ripping out equipment that had already been installed, not just selecting certain equipment in the future. But some reports there suggest the impact may have been an 18 to 24-month delay in the rollout of 5G in the United Kingdom, and all-up costs spread between the telecommunication companies and lost economic productivity in the single-digit billions. But let's just say, Minister, that you are very compelling, you convince the Kiwi Parliament to vote the money, and so Dial-Up proceeds to start making these purchases and get these policies in place. Well, in order to make those rules work in a transparent bidding system, you have to admit that the rules exist. You can't just say that you have an open bidding process and then mysteriously never select any of the e-Utopian firms to be your suppliers, because eventually you just know that Kookaburra Communications or some other e-Utopian firm is going to call your bluff and offer to sell you a cutting-edge IT installation for an entire government department or something for $10 and a pair of Lamingtons. When you say no, if you say no, someone's probably going to start asking questions and filing court challenges. If you go public with that blacklist, however, expect some potential diplomatic backlash. Beijing has been highly critical, for example, of efforts to restrict the use of Huawei technology in the European Union and Canada, while the United States described reports suggesting that China might be instituting restrictions on the use of iPhones in government as retaliation, and indicated the National Security Council was watching the matter with concern. Essentially, part of the challenge here is you have to publicly say who you trust and who you don't. And some of the entities in that latter category may be in a position to pointedly communicate just how little they like being there. But perhaps one of the most difficult challenges to your supply chain security efforts may not even come into effect until after you've at least temporarily succeeded. The problem is a common one across a range of fields, not just supply chain security, and it's basically that preventative measures are seldom satisfying, and that if what you are doing works, over time it may come to be seen as an unnecessary luxury or a massive overreaction. If you fully succeed in establishing a secure, sovereign, or at the very least friendly supply chain, that's probably not going to be what your opponents attempt to target. They'll try and find another weak spot instead. And so over time, there won't be much in terms of high-profile examples of the threats, and people might start to ask whether all of these onerous procedures and additional costs are really necessary. Think of it this way. Imagine there's a bank that's being robbed relatively frequently, so they decide to hire armed security. Now the bank is a harder, less attractive target, so robberies go to zero, the years pass, and eventually a new manager comes along, looks at the budget, and says, hey, we haven't had a robbery attempt in years, we really don't need to be spending this much on security. A saving is then made until the problem potentially re-emerges and the cycle can begin all over again. And that same slightly skewed logic can absolutely be applied at a national level. If you invest heavily and effectively in bushfire prevention, you probably won't have many devastating bushfires, leading people to wonder if you're just wasting your money. And if you invest heavily in a powerful military deterrent, either directly or in combination with your allies, after years and years of not being directly militarily challenged by your opponents, probably because they'd lose, you might get the argument that you haven't been attacked in decades, so the threat clearly isn't out there, and so all that military spending is just a bit of a waste. The same issues can apply to supply chain sovereignty and security efforts. If they work effectively, to some, they're going to look like very expensive and unnecessary overkill. And so, Minister, a few years on, with the budget blowing out, timelines starting to slip, and government priorities shifting to other areas, you yourself might start to wonder whether or not it just wouldn't be cheaper and easier to let at least some e-Utopian tech back into the market. After all, someone did tell you they're doing a pretty good price on pagers. My goal here isn't to try and prescribe or advocate for any particular supply chain policy. There are a lot of factors that go into determining what the right one is for any particular organisation or national context. Instead, the point is that from a defence economics and a counterintelligence perspective, your supply chains absolutely matter. Get it wrong and you can suffer consequences ranging from production jamming up in a crisis, all the way up to suffering a bit of Hezbollah syndrome. But potential countermeasures to those threats are seldom simple and often very expensive. And so as with so many things in defence economics, it ultimately comes down to resource allocation, prioritisation, risk management, and political will. And even then, if like Hezbollah and Iran, you have access to limited manufacturing capacity and or friends, you may always face vulnerabilities that persist, despite your best efforts. Flipping back to Hezbollah and Israel then, I think there's one more aspect of all of this that merits a little bit of a closer look and some discussion. And that is how this apparent Israeli strategy of focusing quite heavily on leadership targets relate to more traditional theories of victory and conflict termination, given that in many major conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries, we've actually seen militaries be relatively reluctant to go after senior political leaders on the opposing side. From a historical perspective, there are a lot of reasons a taboo like that might be in place. Fear of an opponent retaliating in kind, reluctance to potentially create a martyr, deference to a range of legal and ethical concerns. But in this case, it appears to be relatively central to the Israeli strategy against Hezbollah. Given the limits imposed by things like international opinion and the nature of the proxy problem, as we discussed earlier, it strikes me as unlikely that Tel Aviv's intended end goal here would be the final and permanent destruction of Hezbollah. Instead, eventually, there'll presumably need to be a de-escalation of some kind. And depending on what models of national or organisational behaviour you subscribe to, it may not be immediately clear how you might expect to draw a line from targeting the opposing leadership to that kind of target end state. Sometimes in the field of geopolitical analysis, there's a temptation to think of nations and organisations like the factions in a strategy game. Giant resource accumulation machines that enjoy getting more resources, territory, quality of life and global influence, and hate losing resources, territory, quality of life and global influence. With the assumption then being that they will make decisions around things like warfare to maximise their access to those things or whatever else their national objectives might be. For example, if you're looking at an ongoing military conflict between two perfectly rational actors, noting that in the real world, having two perfectly rational actors involved probably isn't always the safest assumption, you would expect the war to continue until both sides reach a point where the peace on offer is more preferable to both of them than the result they expect to receive if they continue fighting. It's essentially a carrot and stick model, where the carrot is how benign or maximalist your war aims are on one hand, and the stick is the amount of military and economic pain you're able to inflict on the other. This is why in the conventional model, there might be such an imperative placed on inflicting damage on your opponent and shifting the trajectory of the conflict. In military struggle, coercion and compromise often go hand in hand. The problem with that far oversimplified conception, however, is that coercion is often linked to cost, and cost is perceived differently by different actors. In an abstract sense, for example, you might have a country or population that deeply values a concept, like freedom, and is willing to sacrifice material resources in order to protect those things. In other cases, you may have populations willing to sacrifice certain principles in the name of peace and personal security. But if we want to zone this in on the topic of deterrence and coercion specifically, what we're really probably concerned with here is what motivates leaders, what shapes decision-making, and thus how you might either deter them from taking escalation decisions you don't want them to take, or force them to come to the table and accept the terms you want. And here again, you can have massive differences between countries and societies. For many countries, including arguably the United States and most of the NATO membership, lives of troops, for example, are a very valuable and sensitive resource. Leaders are likely to be relatively hesitant about putting their troops into harm's way, and if casualty counts start rising, that might be associated with some pretty significant political and social costs. Against that kind of opponent, inflicting a constant trickle of casualties might be enough to force them to the negotiating table. But it might be hard to imagine someone like Kim Jong-un of North Korea responding in the same way. If you tried to deter the North Korean leadership from taking a particular course of action, for example, by arguing that it might cost the lives of 1,000 or 10,000 random North Korean soldiers, it's possible to imagine them being less deterred and more just confused by the concept. The modern North Korean state is not the only example you can see in history or even the present day of that sort of logic being applicable. In the lead up to the February 2022 invasion, for example, some Western analysis seems to have proceeded on the assumption that Vladimir Putin would value things like Russian lives and the Russian economy in the same way a Western leader might. But as the following years have shown, that's an assumption that very much missed the mark. But just as some decision makers might respond differently to the prospect of losing troops, economic resources, territory, international influence, etc., I'd suggest they also might respond differently to threats that are rather more personal in nature. Not to their nations, power, wealth, influence or safety, but to theirs individually or as an elite group. Often you might see nations quite reluctant to follow this line of thinking, not just because of the obvious legal and ethical concerns, which are obviously very much there and should never be forgotten, but rather because in many cases you can imagine it being outright counterproductive. If you're in a conflict with the UK, for example, you'd probably be more likely to secure policy concessions by threatening the Premier League than the wealth or life of the Prime Minister. Similarly, telling your average American that they need to surrender, or you might hit Congress with a missile strike, may not generate the intended result. Against a hypothetical democratic society with strong institutions and not particularly strong popular attachment to the leader, you can imagine that targeting members of the political leadership probably wouldn't achieve much paralysis because the line of succession is clear, and may actually be counterproductive as you generate outrage and force a situation where the successor can hardly give you what you want, lest it look like they're selling out the national interest to preserve their own safety. But if you look at a very different, more autocratic context like North Korea, the calculus might be different. The key decision maker at the end of the day is Kim Jong-un, and the logic may go that while he may not be deterred by threats to North Korean soldiers or the North Korean economy, he might be deterred by stated or implied threats to Kim Jong-un. And on what I'm sure is a completely unrelated note, back in 2016, the Republic of Korea's defense minister was asked in their National Assembly whether or not the country had a special forces unit assembled that could eliminate Kim Jong-un in the event of a conflict. The minister reportedly responded, yes, we do have such a plan, and would go on to say that South Korea has a general idea and plan to use precision missile capabilities to target enemy facilities in major areas, as well as eliminating the enemy's leadership. End quote. Somehow I doubt the implied threat was any more subtle in the original Korean. And I need to stress this was hardly a once-off or moment-in-time thing. In 2023, as the US and ROK were preparing for joint special operations drills, again alluded to the concept, saying that training for decapitation strikes against the North Korean leader remained an option. If you were to render down the implied threat, the nature of the deterrence that's being attempted here, it's basically this. You could argue the core deterrence message here, being sent to Kim Jong-un and those around him, is that if you do start a war with the South, you probably won't live to see the end of it. The reason I bring all this up is because there is still significant debate amongst analysts as to what exactly Israel is trying to achieve by focusing on the leadership of organisations like Hamas and Hezbollah, and what that will mean not just for the combat power of those organisations in the short term, but also their decision-making and behaviour in the future. Whether or not losing leaders makes Hezbollah more or less likely to accept some sort of official or unofficial de-escalation is something that I think sits in the time will tell category. Arguably another element of this is that while targeting Iranian leaders might be considered another step or two up the escalation ladder, the core mechanics might not be entirely different. And so seeing the intelligence and security failures, accusations of treason and very high casualty count amongst the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah may or may not shape the decision-making calculus in the IRGC or at the top of the Iranian leadership. The core point, perhaps, is that it's generally more difficult to quantify or predict the results of efforts to achieve deterrence or war goals by attacking or threatening to attack the lives and interests of opposing leaders. There are historical cases of leaders being lost, becoming martyrs, and as a result, resistance actually intensifying. In other cases, losing key leaders has caused an effort to crumble. And it seems likely that only time will ultimately tell where Hezbollah and its backers sit on that particular spectrum, now that so much of the executive leadership has been kinetically reshuffled. So with that topic explored, I want to move on to some closing thoughts. The first thing is that I think it's important to remember that what we've talked about today is really only a very small part of a much wider conflict. You can't really view the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in isolation. You have to take into account the context of Gaza, Iranian influence, regional politics, and arguably even the role of major global powers with stated interests in the region. In that context, it seems exceptionally unlikely that any military or covert activity, no matter how dramatic, is ever going to have a decisive effect on its own. The whole Pager incident no doubt represents a massive intelligence success for Israel and a stunning security failure for Hezbollah. There probably isn't a way to put a positive spin on getting a number of your people killed or wounded by explosive devices that you may, indirectly, have paid your opponent for. And the combination of casualties, communications disruption, and the compounding damage done by follow-up Israeli strikes will likely have had a significant impact on the ability of Hezbollah to coordinate and fight. But in the same vein, I think the evidence suggests that while this might make it harder for Hezbollah to fight, it's unlikely to put Hezbollah out of the fight. And it very much remains to be seen how the Hezbollah-Israel conflict will evolve going forward. Whether that means something like an intensified exchange of air, artillery and missile attacks, or potentially ground incursions into Lebanon on a larger scale. However the situation evolves, however, it's arguably already got some lessons to teach, both for those organisations and countries out there that might be looking to better protect their supply chains, but also those potentially looking to take advantage of weaknesses in their opponents. For a country like Russia, for example, with the defence industry still reportedly quite reliant on foreign components brought in through sanction-busting efforts, this story arguably highlights some of the potential vulnerabilities that an approach like that can bring. So far from the open source, most of what we've seen from Ukraine's various allies have been efforts intended to clamp down on the supply of components into the Russian economy, as opposed to attempts to use those flows as a conduit for sabotage or intelligence gathering. But whether or not that changes in the future, now that the approach has potentially been very publicly and clearly validated by recent events, only time will tell. And okay, quick channel update to close out. I'm aware this topic is one that came up a couple of weeks ago, and it's certainly been pretty widely covered on YouTube at this point. But I was particularly determined not to jump on the initial reporting and instead wait to see what additional details came out in the following weeks. I think ultimately that approach was validated as we started to get more details about the nature of the sabotage, the operation, and how it fits into a broader operational context. Although I suspect this is a good example of an incident where we'll likely continue to be very unsure about what exactly happened for many, many years to come. So far as future content goes, unless something dramatically unexpected happens, we won't be doubling up on the Middle East, so it'll be back to a different theatre next week. And also, by the time this one goes live, there should be a post up on Patreon for the patrons, just seeking your input as promised over what of the remaining materials I still have from CADX that I didn't include in the episode that you might want to see on that platform there. Beyond that, I won't dwell on much this week, just extend my thanks again to all of you that continue to engage with and support the channel, as well, of course, as the channel sponsors. And as always, I very much hope to see you all again next week.